I'm looking into photographic processes as well as the performance of the photograph and what it can do with the materiality of the photograph itself. In one of my more recent projects, I did a series of walks in an area of Italy where my father was born. And the walks were really just part of a daily ritual I was doing whilst I was there. But the point of being there at that time was to actually make work. So I started thinking about what that meant and how these walks could somehow be a part of that project. And so I decided to, as a way of recording the landscape and a way of recording this performance, I used large format colour film and taped it to my body across my heart, and I would go for these long epic walks in the forests and the mountains. The temperature of my body, the sweat, all of these things would kind of embed themselves on the negative. So each walk would have a different negative and have a different effect on the film itself. Most of my projects come from an initial, quite simple idea, and then I will look at that idea and try to unpack it as much as I can. So for example, if I'm working on something about the sea, I'll look at a Gerhard Richter painting of the sea, or I'll read a science text about global warming, or I'll always try and look at the idea and how it's represented in other fields and research practices. Yeah, which is kind of helps me to kind of articulate what it is about this particular simple idea that I can abstract and then often redefine or filter to get what I really want out of that idea. When making my work, I do come up against quite a few challenges, whether they be material or conceptual challenges. I'm not a studio-based artist. I don't go to the studio every day and stay there for 8 hours and make something and tear it apart and begin again. That's not really my process. But when I do face those challenges and when I'm exhausted of just sitting in silence or staring at the same thing for one time, I'll phone a friend. I'll have a conversation about it, because often when you think something is a really good idea, when you say it out loud, it sounds quite ridiculous, and you can hear it and change your mind. It's very common for me to make several shows and throw them out before I get to the final outcome, and that works. It's a way of resolving the bigger things that I'm concerned with. Experimentation is an integral part of my practice. The processes in the practice where my work currently sits is in between analog and digital photography. So there is a lot of experimentation that goes on in both the darkroom and in creating the images themselves. My recent work, I've been working with cameraless images, which kind of releases that sense of control that we think we have over photography. So each attempt or each act, especially the walking works that I recently did, there was no control. There was one attempt, and whatever was embedded in that attempt was the result. And I didn't manipulate it or abstract it. I had to accept exactly what that was. So, and the thing that existed on the negative. And then the experimentation more came into, within the darkroom, the scale and the outcome that these negatives were going to be displayed at. And those scales changed several times before I finally was happy with what I exhibited for that project. In my last body of work called Useless Gestures, it was a series of photographic prints as well as a series of sculptural objects. And the objects themselves were made out of beeswax. Because my practice the majority of it is in a photographic practice, I wanted to also create objects that had the same malleability and fragility that the photo negative can have. So I needed to look at a material that would be affected by the environment, that would be affected by heat in the same way that the negatives were affected when I exposed them. So wax seemed to be something that I really wanted to work with. I'd never worked with it before. It was very difficult. And again, I didn't have a studio at the time, so my kitchen became a little wax workshop where several dear friends and other artists would come to my aid because I really needed help in achieving what I wanted to achieve. It's great to have an idea, but then to kind of be able to execute it to the level that you want it to be, you often have to ask for help or outsource, which I'm more comfortable doing. Once I graduated art school, I did pursue residency programs and tried to focus on my practice for the first year, which was really wonderful, but always in the back of my mind was the sustainability of what I was doing. So I wanted to go back to art school to do a master's degree because I felt that with a master's degree I would have more options, whether that be teaching or even trying to expand my practice further. And I actually decided to do a master's in curatorial studies because I felt that I always wanted to focus on my practice, but I wanted something that supported it. So I did the curatorial studies and then got quite a few jobs and moved through like art administration, working for different organisations and starting my own organisation. Continually having my own practice, but it was hard to balance the two things. And more recently, I've now stepped back from the curatorial side of my practice and am focusing on my practice itself. My art practice is really influenced by research and history and untold histories and stories and storytelling. And I think that really works quite well with my curatorial practice because that's how I approach my curatorial practice. There's different ways of telling stories and different ways of presenting ideas in different contexts. I couldn't really separate those two things. I don't want to have to choose because I feel like they're important to each other. Yeah, the conversation between those things informs both practices.